Hi, I'm Jeff Masek from the NASA Goddard Space Flight Center. I'm a research scientist here at NASA Goddard, and I'm also the Landsat project scientist. And today I'm going to be talking about how to use Landsat data to provide indicators of climate change across the Earth, particularly focusing today on ecosystem response to climate change. Before I start, I want to thank Sangram Ganguly and Raman Namani for helping to put on this series of presentations and for inviting me to take part. So this is an outline of what I'm going to be talking about today. We'll start with the big picture, which is to understand how global ecosystems are going to change over the next 100 to 200 years under a warming climate. We're then going to sort of switch gears a little bit and talk about the Landsat program itself, some of the technologies involved, some of the opportunities that Landsat provides for looking at long-term impacts of climate change, and also some of the challenges involved in producing long-term data records. And then finally, we're going to wrap up by looking at some case studies from around the globe where people have applied the satellite data record to gain new understanding. So to start with the big picture, as we all know, global temperatures continue to increase around the world due to the input of carbon dioxide and other fossil fuels into the atmosphere from industrial activities. This is the most recent compendium of global temperature data from the IPCC, put out last year. And a lot of attention has been paid to the last 10 years where temperatures have sort of leveled off a bit, and questions about why that is. But the bottom line is that if you look at temperatures on a decadal average, they're continuing to increase steadily through time. Now, as you might expect, it's reasonable to expect that vegetation systems around the globe are going to respond to these increasing temperatures and changing precipitation patterns. This is a slide from one of Rama's old papers. If he's watching, he'll probably recognize it and give a shout of approval to me for showing it. This is from his science paper, where his team went ahead and used an ecosystem model to look at what the limiting factors for vegetation growth were around the world, whether it was temperature in high latitudes, water in arid regions, or radiation in cloud-covered regions in the tropics. So, as you might expect, as the temperature regime and the climate regime shifts over the next few hundred years, we would expect that the vegetation regimes will track that to some extent. The question becomes, how fast is that likely to occur? To look at the question of how fast vegetation patterns can shift, we use dynamic global vegetation models, or DGVMs. These are a class of mechanistic models that incorporate things like plant productivity, competitive pressure among species, and of course climate forcing to understand how climate regimes change as as vegetation regimes change as the climate changes. Now, these models are actually fairly simple in a lot of ways. And so what they tend to do is, as the climate regime or envelope shifts, the vegetation envelope shifts with them, and they tend to predict very rapid changes in vegetation patterns over the next 100 to 200 years. This is an example from a paper by Lucht et al. Using the European LPJ model. And what it shows is, for a variety of plant functional types, very large changes in the area of those types, or the fractional area of those types, over the next 100 years. So, for example, evergreen needleleaf forest across the temperate region is largely replaced with deciduous broadleaf forests. And so you can think of the evergreen needleleaf forests of the Great Lakes in New England sort of migrating north, and in turn being replaced by the broadleaf forests in, say, the Mid-Atlantic or the Ohio Valley. So those are very large changes. That's, several hundred kilometers of advance by a tree species over a course of just 100 years. And so it raises the question, given that we've already had sort of 50 years of satellite data and 100 years of global warming, shouldn't we already see evidence for these biome shifts, either on the ground or in the satellite record? And in fact, for researchers who go out in the field and look at individual plots, there is quite a bit of evidence for changes in vegetation patterns that are aligned with what you'd expect from changes in climate that have occurred recently. This is a fairly complicated chart, so I won't go into it in detail. But basically, each of these dots, this is from the IPCC, by the way, each of these dots shows a field study where there have been noted shifts in vegetation type. And in general, these conform to what you'd expect. So, for example, increases in shrub area advancing into bare tundra in the northern latitudes, changes in tree line. In the case of Africa, decreasing area of treed savanna and increasing aridity, for example. Now, one of the key aspects of the satellite data records is it helps to bridge the gap between those local plots studies and the sort of global scale of the DGVMs that we talked about. There are a variety of satellite resources that can be used for tracking vegetation patterns, AVHR and MODIS, for example. The key one that I work with, and I'm going to talk about today, is the Landsat satellite record. I think most people are familiar with Landsat data in a general way. The key aspect for what I'm going to talk about today is the fact that it has a 4-decade record. So we've taken consistent measurements since 1972 when Landsat 1 was launched. Now, that's not a lot of time compared to how the Earth evolves or climate evolves, but it's enough time for population around the globe to basically double, and for the most rapid part of the global warming curve that I showed the first slide to occur. So we're really sampling a key part of recent Earth history with the Landsat program. Landsat also has a 30-meter spatial resolution, so it's sufficient to differentiate human and natural land impacts. And really important, it's useful for looking at the heterogeneity of the landscape and how different landscape components respond to climate change. And that's very important, as we'll see in a little bit. Some of the other technical attributes of the Landsat system are listed here. We have global coverage with a 16-day revisit, although that coverage has not been consistent through the mission life, as we'll talk about in a moment. We have spectral coverage through the visible, the near-infrared, the shortwave IR, and the thermal IR. And, very important, it's a partnership between NASA and the USGS, and has been actually since the origin of the program in the late 1960s. So with the Landsat archive, we can look at 4 decades worth of change across the planet. So we can understand how human and climate forcings have conspired to change physical and biological systems. This is a nice example from Lake Chad in Niger, where a combination of increased irrigation and water consumption, together with a decrease in precipitation, has ended up shrinking Lake Chad dramatically over the last 40 years. Now, one of the key aspects or key events that occurred in the history of the Landsat program happened in 2008, when the U.S. Geological Survey opened the archive for free distribution. In the bad old days, back when Landsat was commercially operated, a single image could cost as much as $4,000 to $5,000 per scene. And so in today's dollars, that's probably closer to like $10,000 per scene. Since 2008, all of the data have been available for free, and there's been as much data as you want you can download. And so this has really put a new energy into the analysis of Landsat data. There's been a focus on leveraging the time domain, so to look at interannual processes such as disturbance, compositional change, and land use, and also an energy toward larger and larger scales of analysis. So for example, you see here the US composites from David Roy that he's producing on a regular basis now, or maybe you saw Matt Hansen's paper in Science last year where he analyzed 500,000 Landsat scenes in order to assess global deforestation. And finally, there's also an increased focus on biophysical products. And these are the kind of products you need if you're going to start to translate from the global vegetation models and climate forcing into observations. And so, for example, some of Sangram's work here showing off a leaf area index derived from a radiative transfer model for all of California. It's also important to realize that the Landsat program has evolved through time from a technical standpoint. The early missions, Landsats 1 through 3, were really in sort of a tech demo mode. They had very primitive capabilities compared to what we have today. 4 spectral bands just through the near-infrared, and about 80-meter spatial resolution. Starting in the early 1980s with Landsats 4 and 5, we moved on to having 30-meter spatial resolution and coverage into the shortwave and thermal infrared. And then finally, with Landsat 8, we just successfully launched that last February. It's now collecting data, and people are quite happy with it. We added a couple of new spectral bands to the portfolio and also significantly improved the radiometric quality of the data and make it more suitable for the sort of biophysical products that I mentioned before. So in addition to cost, computing power has been historically a real roadblock to using large volumes of Landsat data. This is an example of what you had to work with in the 1970s, a COMTOL image processing unit. In fact, when the mission was first conceived, there were only a few of these types of units around the country. And most users would actually have to take a line printout with the digital numbers of the image printed out on a line printer, and then take crayons with different colors and contour the images. And then you'd stand on a step stool and interpret your image. That's kind of the hard way to do it. Even when I was a graduate student in the 1980s, you could only deal with a quarter of a Landsat frame at a time on most desktop computers. Today, we have systems that can deal with hundreds of Landsat frames on desktop environments. And we have things like the NEX Hyperwall, or the NEX computing environment at Ames, where people are now bringing algorithms to the data and being able to process thousands and hundreds of thousands of images at a time. So the scale of computing has really increased, and that's helping us utilize the Landsat data for scientific purposes. Now, when Rama talked to me about this presentation, he mentioned that he also wanted to discuss some of the challenges associated with producing long-term climate quality data records. And to some extent, this is true for any satellite record. It doesn't have to be Landsat. It's a tough job when you think about it. All of our satellite missions are conceived of on a single mission by single mission sort of point of view. They last for 5 or 10 years. And at the same time, you're trying to create a long-term record that spans 30, 40, 50 years. And so you're putting together disparate missions that are evolving through time and trying to produce a consistent biophysical or geophysical measurement. What you want to make sure of is that what's changing is the Earth system you're looking at, not the instrumentation that's creating it. So there are a set of issues, particularly for Landsat, that we have to think about when we're producing climate quality data records. The first is the quantity of data. As I said before, Landsat, although we talk about it as though it collects globally every 16 days, over the lifetime of the mission, it hasn't always done that. Particularly in the 1980s and early 1990s, there are gaps in the record for various parts of the world, and so you have to be careful that there's actually enough cloud-free imagery to produce a long-term record for where you want to work. The second element is data quality. Calibration is extremely important. Again, if the observation itself is changing through time because of the instrumentation, that's an insufficient basis for detecting climate-related trends. And then finally, a variety of questions related to the analysis approach itself that boil down to the question is the trend or the variability you're trying to detect statistically significant compared to the uncertainty of the measurement itself? And we'll talk more about that in a second. In terms of calibration, this is an example from, next slide. There we go. This is an example from the Sonora Desert before we undertook a cross-calibration exercise a few years ago, so this probably dates from about 2009 or 2010. The Sonora Desert is actually a very stable invariant site. So if the data were properly calibrated, you'd see all of these different Landsat missions since 1972 should record about the same radiance through time, and in fact, they don't. Each mission recorded its own family of radiance, and of course that's not suitable for looking at long-term change. We went ahead, and these are slides, by the way, from Dennis Helder from South Dakota State University. He went ahead and cross-calibrated Landsat 5 to Landsat 7, and then worked his way back through the record and ended up with a much better, much more stable record. So Landsat is now much better calibrated than it ever was before. It's important to realize, though, that the uncertainty of the measurement is going to increase as you go back in time because of that bootstrapping backwards in time. If you look at Landsat 7, we have about a 3% uncertainty in terms of surface reflectance. If you go back to Landsat 5, that probably increases to closer to 5% and keeps increasing as you go back. And then, as I said before, the real question in terms of trying to detect climate-related trends, these are fairly subtle changes in vegetation properties. And so is the physical variability greater than the noise of the measurement? And is the trend greater than the variability in the time series itself? Right. So here's an example where we have a series of observations, and if you don't include the uncertainty in the geophysical parameter itself, you might think that that's a pretty reliable trend. On the other hand, if you do include the uncertainty, which are represented by these error bars, you really can't necessarily say anything about the trend itself. So it's important to understand both the variability of the measurements as well as their uncertainty. And so here I've listed for Landsat in particular, for looking at vegetation, some of the uncertainties that need to be included, including the calibration, as I said before, changes in BRDF because of either the solar angle varying if you're not on an anniversary date, or the view geometry varying if you're looking at adjacent scenes, uncertainty in an atmospheric correction or whatever radiometric corrections you do, geolocation, and then finally, after you get your radiance or your reflectance, you tend to put that through an algorithm or a model, and that in turn induces further uncertainty into the derived physical parameter. So all stuff that has to be thought about when producing climate quality satellite records. All right, so what I want to do for the remainder of the talk is to talk about a series of case studies around the globe where Landsat data have been used to look at climate impacts on ecosystems or the physical system. I'm focusing today on ecosystems because that's what I do, but it's important to realize that Landsat are also used to look at physical properties as well. So we'll start off by looking at the question of northern high latitude greening. If you look at a map of temperature change, although temperatures are steadily marching upward, it's not a uniform pattern across the globe. In fact, most of the warming for global warming is concentrated at the high northern latitudes. That's in large part because of the sea ice albedo feedback. As the sea ice dissipates, the water is darker, absorbs more energy, and so those high latitudes tend to warm faster. So it makes sense that if you want to look for early indicators, sort of the canary in the coal mine of how climate change is impacting ecosystems, you might want to look at those particular regions. And sure enough, some of the early studies using the AVHRR satellite system, the Coarse Resolution Global Satellite System, used the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index and did find significant evidence for greening or increased NDVI at high latitudes. So these are some of the papers that you can look up to get more information. The original study was by Ranga Maineni in 1997, but since then there have been a whole series of other studies that have basically confirmed that circumarctic greening pattern. Now, one of the troubles with AVHRR is it doesn't give you very much spatial perspective. So what we wanted to do in a study a few years ago was to zoom in with Landsat on a particular transect. And so we looked at Quebec, a transect from north to south through Quebec, and assembled a time series of Landsat imagery, roughly about 10 to 20 images from 1985 to 2010 for each of these sites, each of these frames within that transect. And this is a particularly interesting area to look at because it has both rapid summer warming as well as rapid winter warming, which is somewhat unique for Canada. And what we found is, sure enough, strong positive NDVI trends, particularly in the northern half of the transect. About 98% of the trends we detected that weren't related to, say, recovery from fire or something like that, were positive in nature, and the mean trend was about 0.007 NDVI per year. So, a big NDVI change is probably 0.1 or 0.2, something like that, and so over the course of 20 years, we're looking at some very significant changes in the amount of vegetation in this transect. It's also interesting that in the forest-covered, forest-dominated areas in the south is where we don't see a significant trend. So this trend is really not related to forest expansion so much as it is shrub and grassland. And that's brought out in this analysis where we actually compared our NDVI trends to the Canadian Centre for Remote Sensing land cover product, which is a 30-meter resolution land cover product, and found that the majority of the greening was coming from shrub and grass types that they had mapped in 2000. So this was actually in line with several studies that have already been published using field data. people have noticed increases in this area in dwarf birch cover. There are a variety of reasons why this particular species is so sensitive to warmer temperatures, but one of the hypotheses is that it's tied to earlier spring warming, which increases microbial activity in the soil. These are nutrient-limited plants, and so the earlier microbial activity releases nitrogen to the soil. The birch takes it up and goes crazy, and that's the origin of the trend that we're seeing. This is published, by the way, in a paper by Kelly McManus in Global Change Biology that came out a couple of years ago. So one of the things that we wanted to do was to go back to the original problem and understand how the observations that we made with Landsat related to what the dynamic global vegetation models would actually predict. So to do that, we used the LPJ model. I showed an example of that earlier. And basically supplied the climate regime for the Landsat era, 1972 to 2009, and had LPJ go ahead and calculate what it thought the vegetation changes should be in terms of composition and structure and amount of vegetation. And so this is basically the results of that study. The red line here on the overview map gives you the spatial domain of these profiles. One profile represents a transect from 1972. The other profile represents a transect from 2009. And our Landsat Quebec transect that I showed you earlier is this sort of red box inset here. And so what we're plotting is basically from north to south, the amount of FPAR, and you can think of that as the contribution to vegetation greenness, provided by each of these plant functional types. And so what you see is basically an increase in the grass fraction in the high northern areas. You also see an increase in this boreal broadleaf deciduous type in this narrow zone just south of the grasses, and then not very much change in the temperate types farther to the south. And that, in a lot of ways, is aligned with what we saw in the Landsat record. So this is a nice example of how the LPJ model is actually predicting patterns that are similar to what we see in the satellite record. Now, one thing that the LPJ model does do is it's a very simple model. So it basically just shows a steady advance of vegetation types in this sort of broad band across northern Canada. In reality, the situation is a lot more complex. And in part, LPJ has a hard time sort of revealing that just because of the heterogeneity of the landscape. It has no way of incorporating all of these different barriers to how vegetation and biomes shift. Things like lakes that impede seed dispersal and bare patches and so forth. And that's one of the reasons why we're interested in doing this kind of work at Landsat resolution, is that we can actually incorporate that landscape heterogeneity directly into these sort of global models. People have also looked at the question of northern hemisphere greening in other areas. This is a nice study that came out recently from Gerald Frost and colleagues at University of Virginia, where they looked at long-term greening trends in northwestern Siberia. And again, the heterogeneity of the landscape is brought out. They went ahead and used high-resolution air photography and satellite data to map locations where there are new alder stands. That's another sort of shrub type in this area, and then related that to areas where they saw greening trends from the Landsat record. And there was a correspondence between new alder stands that were emergent and where they were seeing the greening trends at the 30-meter resolution. And they also saw a bunch of areas where there weren't obvious greening trends, except where there was disturbance. And so their explanation here is that basically these are very poor soils, they're low in nitrogen again. You have a landslide, for example, that exposes new organic material, and then suddenly the alder takes advantage of that environment. So kind of a really nice example of how small-scale heterogeneity makes a big difference and really controls the sort of the micro scale of how biomes change through time. Now, most of what we've seen so far has been short stature vegetation changes, grasses, shrubs migrating into tundra. We tend not to see so much change in forest environments. Forests, as individuals, are very long-lived. It takes a long time for them to grow, and so their sort of march across the landscape you would intuitively expect to be fairly slow. The one exception is areas where altitude limits tree line. And in a number of these areas around the world, we can use Landsat data and see progressive changes in tree line through time. This is an example from Siberia. Slava Huruk from the Sukachev Institute has done a lot of work in this area and has shown that fir and pine are increasing in these mountainous environments, essentially marching upward, and the ecotone is changing in elevation at about a meter per year. And sort of marching into these otherwise barren or grass-covered areas. Now, if we look at, so basically we've talked about areas where vegetation is sort of increasing as temperatures warm in northern latitudes. In other parts of the world, there are what we call trailing edge phenomena. So these are areas where conditions are becoming less favorable for vegetation, or at least the vegetation types that are there now. And primarily these are in semi-arid regions where you've got changes in precipitation patterns or increases in temperature which are causing drought and stress. So Craig Allen from the U.S. Geological Survey has spent a lot of time compiling field studies and outlining areas where tree mortality or increased tree mortality has been reported. And a lot of these areas are in semi-arid zones such as the Mediterranean and the western United States. So this is a study that Jim Vogelman from the USGS conducted, published a few years ago in Remote Sensing of Environment, where they used Landsat to map one of these areas in the southwestern US where forests are reported to be declining. Jim is using a spectral index, which uses the shortwave infrared and the near-infrared ratio, and he has published that previously as being related to conifer health. And what he sees is substantial changes in this ratio corresponding to conifer mortality, sort of in a ring around this mountainous environment, which is related to basically disease and pest infestation. Here's an example of how he's using that particular index and seeing it change through time and being able to extract that trend. Again, obviously calibrated data are very important for being able to do that kind of work. And he's able to extend this kind of approach to look at canopy change across the Four Corners area of the southwestern US, so Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado. And here he's showing areas primarily of canopy cover decrease in some of the conifer forests in the southwest, some areas of canopy cover increase as well. And when you look at in detail at the places where he's mapping declining canopy cover, it turns out that there's sort of a range of explanations for what's going on. So this is the Landsat imagery over here on the left. This is his shortwave infrared index and canopy cover trends. And then this is information from the US Forest Service on the type of disease or pathology that's going on in those particular areas. And so there's a pretty good correspondence between where he's mapping canopy cover change and where the Forest Service says that there's decline going on. But what's also interesting is that the reason for the decline varies from place to place and is not really all that consistent. What is consistent is that warmer temperatures are behind most of these phenomena, whether it's drought stress or in the case of beetle infestation, you're changing the life cycle of the beetle, you're not having as much winter mortality because of warmer winter temperatures. And so there's sort of a combined pathology associated with warmer temperatures that's causing mortality in western forests. So these types of studies have been carried out elsewhere as well. This is another semi-arid example from the Ebro Valley in Spain that was published by Vicente Serrano et al. A couple of years ago. And here they're looking at declining shrublands in the Ebro Valley. They note that temperatures have been increasing steadily over the last 30 or 40 years. Precipitation really hasn't changed that much. It's been sort of bouncing up and down, but there isn't a clear trend. But because temperatures are increasing, there's greater evaporative stress, and that is probably leading to the decline in the shrubland area that they report. There's also a number of studies that have looked at vegetation dynamics in tropical areas related to climate change. This is a particularly interesting one in Florida, where they've charted the change in mangrove area through Landsat time series history. This is by Kavanaugh et al. From Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Mangroves happen to be fairly easy to map in Landsat imagery, so it's a really nice target for looking at change through time. And what they see is basically a dramatic expansion in the area of mangroves at the northern limit of the distribution of the species in Florida. And this actually correlates with an area where there's a decreasing probability of hard freeze. So that's nights where it gets below -4 degrees C. And so as the climate warms and that zone of hard freeze kind of migrates to the north, suddenly the mangroves seem to take off. So that's an interesting example also of kind of a nonlinear response. Like there's a threshold in temperature, not much happens until you cross that threshold, and then suddenly in that area you see a big response. Now it's also an interesting study because it's kind of controversial. Geary and Long published a response to that paper and noted that Kavanaugh's study basically ran from 1984 to 2011, and that they just missed, by 1 year, a major freeze event on the East Coast, which knocked back the mangrove area and density in this area that they're studying. And so it brings up an interesting question. Is this actually a climate-related trend, or is this just a recovery from some periodic disturbance that could have happened 100 years ago or 200 years ago? It brings up a key point, which is that our satellite record, although 40 years is great, it's not that long compared to the time scale over which climate evolves and Earth processes evolve. So you have to be very careful when you're looking at trends, that you're actually looking at a secular trend and not just a periodic disturbance. So this brings up a question, which is how does climate mediate ecosystem change? So far we've been looking at this sort of left-hand part of the box, where we've just been assuming that climate impacts vegetation directly, whether it's through productivity or nutrient availability or something like that. But in addition, or maybe even more important, is the question of disturbance and succession as a process. So climate can influence things like the proclivity for forest fires or insect outbreaks, tree mortality, and those processes happen on their own, even if the climate's not changing as well. And it's really the succession part of that may be the trigger for biome migration. Right? So disturbance can kind of reset the landscape and reset the competitive pressures, and suddenly a new vegetation community can arise in response to the current climate. So it may be this sort of disturbance and succession element that's really key for seeing how climate mediates future biome shifts through time. And then finally, on the right-hand side, the other thing that we really haven't talked about in this presentation is the human impact. The vast majority of ecosystems around the world are in fact managed at this point, either directly or indirectly. And so climate obviously plays a role in sort of governing how humans manage ecosystems, and then that obviously plays a huge role in the composition and structure of current ecosystems. Well, so far we've talked almost entirely about the biosphere, biological systems. I want to say a little bit at least about physical climate indicators that can be derived from Landsat. Now there are a variety of them, and there are literally hundreds, actually thousands of papers published on these types of topics. But some of them are listed here. People have looked at mountain glacier extent through time around the world and have deduced that the majority of mountain glaciers and tidewater glaciers are retreating. Ice sheet velocities in the major ice sheets of Antarctica and Greenland. Changes in surface water extent, lake area, and lake condition. Permafrost collapse and the associated formation of lakes through ponding or the draining of permafrost lakes, and also geomorphic changes, particularly along coastlines. This is a particularly nice example from Song et al. In remote sensing of the environment, where they went ahead and used a variety of remote sensing data sets, including Landsat, to quantify the change in lake area across the Tibetan Plateau since the 1970s. And if you look at the upper left-hand image, what they find is basically a period from the mid-1970s to 1990 where lake areas were contracting throughout the plateau, and presumably water levels were dropping. That started to reverse in the 1990s, and from 2000 to 2011, there's sort of their third mapping epoch. What they see is a tremendous increase in lake area. Now, in this era, they're also able to use other satellite resources, such as IceSat glass, to look at the elevation of the lakes, which are increasing, and GRACE, which is a NASA gravity mission, which can chart or map water storage, and the water storage amount is increasing at the same time. When they went ahead and looked at the regional climate trends, it was pretty interesting because, sort of like Spain we saw earlier, the temperature is increasing pretty steadily throughout the plateau with all the available met stations. Precipitation isn't really changing very much, but in any case, the increase in ET isn't really consistent with what you'd expect for increasing lake area, which is what they saw from the satellite data. And so the explanation that they come up with is that it's more likely to be caused by increased melting of mountain glaciers, which are feeding these lakes. So not so much precipitation increases or short-term water balance, but a long-term provision of water from these melting mountain glaciers, at least temporarily increasing the water balance on the plateau. Of course, what will happen over the next few decades remains to be seen. And just a quick sort of shout out to a project here at Goddard that's very interesting. My colleague Mark Carroll is taking some of the same techniques, some spectral mixing analysis, and determining changes in water dynamics using Landsat data across the above field campaign region in northern Canada and Alaska. For those of you who haven't heard, ABOVE is a new NASA-sponsored field campaign to understand the impacts of climate change on Arctic and boreal systems. And so as a precursor project for that activity, Mark has gone ahead and started to map changes in water extent. Next slide. So for example, these are some preliminary results from one lake in Alberta, Canada, which is showing very large changes in lake area over this time period. This isn't necessarily consistent. He sees both increases in lake area and decreases in lake area where he's looking. All right, so to wrap up, I want to spend a second talking about the role of satellite remote sensing in supporting some of the climate assessments that are going on right now. Assessments have become this sort of benchmark for getting the science community around the table and producing consensus results on environmental issues, and then presenting the results in a way that, that can affect policy making and decision making. There are two assessments that are really important going on right now. The first is the National Climate Assessment. The third NCA was released this year in 2014. And it's basically a compendium of information from federal agencies and federal scientists that detail the regional and sectoral impacts of climate change on the U.S. For the first time, it includes a report on climate indicators. So these are key variables for long-term monitoring of climate change and impacts on biology and the physical systems within the nation. Things like changes in forest biomass, changes in hydrologic storage and runoff, and the like. The second key assessment that's going on now is, of course, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and we've seen several examples from the fifth assessment report that came out in the last couple of years. In this fifth assessment report, there's an increased emphasis on regional impacts of climate change and adaptation strategies. So it's not enough just to sort of document how the climate is changing or the mechanisms behind it, but to really understand what the impacts are and what people might actually do about it to improve their lives. In particular, Working Group 2 report talks about the climate impacts on physical and biological systems, so that's a good resource if you're looking for information on the state of the knowledge on climate change impacts and indicators. And the third point is really key, which is that remote sensing is playing an increasingly important role in feeding these assessment reports. And then there's the editorial statement that, despite the increasing importance, it's probably still an underused resource for mapping climate impacts. There are some future directions which I think are going to help that, though. And so one of the things that we're sort of marching toward now is ensuring the continuity of the Landsat program through 2038. This is an important evolution in the Landsat program in that the federal government has, for the first time, recommended a long-term program of Landsat observations and a 20-year program. Landsat has never had that. It's always been sort of a one-off series of missions that have been funded individually. So for the first time, we can actually start to think, over the long term and how the system should evolve in a sustainable way. It remains to be seen exactly what the recommendations are going to be, but sometime next year we should have a much better idea of where Landsat is going to go in the future. We also can look forward to what I think of as better capabilities through sensor integration. In particular, we're going to see much better temporal resolution from the sort of Landsat class of satellites with the launch of the ESA Sentinel-2 system starting next year. Sentinel-2 is kind of a Landsat-like series of satellites. It actually has better temporal repeat by itself than Landsat does. But the key point is that if you combine it with, say, Landsat 8, you can end up with 2 to 3 day revisit times globally for the entire planet. So this opens up a new world of possibilities for looking at things like vegetation phenology and short-term changes and sort of how do vegetation systems respond to short-term stresses that you have a hard time getting to with Landsat right now. I think there's going to be a greater focus, there still is a greater focus on data quality and calibration. This leads to better biophysical parameter estimates and more sort of stable products. So these are the climate quality records that we want to get to in order to chart long-term changes through time. And also, I think, as we sort of saw with the dynamic vegetation models, probably a greater integration of remote sensing with physical and ecosystem models. So we have this 40-year record of observations which span one of the key periods of how climate change is affecting the planet. We can use that to sort of nowcast the climate impacts and compare it with what the models are saying should be happening and really sort of understand the system much better that way. One of the things that's going to help us in that regard are moving toward higher level products from Landsat. One of the things about Landsat is you've basically been able to download images and that's pretty much it. What we're now moving toward is a model more like EOS or MODIS, where there are a series of standard products, either low-level products like temperature and reflectance, or higher-level products like leaf area index and biophysical variables. USGS is really leading the way here, and they are working to create a suite of these higher-level products based on the GTOS essential climate variables that have been documented. So the first 4 that they're focused on are a 30-meter global land cover, surface water extent, burned area, and snow-covered area, and trying to create long-term records of those variables within the US and eventually worldwide as well. So that's something that's really exciting that we're going to want to keep our eye on. And then finally, the thing that's also really key are the new processing approaches. And here I'll give a brief commercial to our sponsors at NEX, where you can start to take algorithms and apply them to stores of data and start to create operational climate indicators from Landsat by processing very large volumes of data for the first time. So that's also really key and an exciting development in the remote sensing arena. So with that, I'm going to conclude. I want to thank you for paying attention, and I think there'll be an opportunity to ask and answer questions online. And if you want more information about the Landsat program itself, I have a list of web and internet resources here, a few websites from NASA, as well as our Facebook page and our Twitter feed. So thank you very much.